Hello and welcome to the Humans Over Numbers podcast, the show that's willing to stand on its head to see the workplace from a new perspective. This show is brought to you by Milestones, makers of the Beyond This Day, Small Wonders, and other keepsake gifts for employees recognizing major life events. Request your sample today at milestonescompany.com and see the impact they make for yourself. I am Felix Dusablon, hungry bookworm and aspiring polymath, and on the show I have today Eric Kershat. He is the founder of HR Hot Seat and owner of Harmony Insights, and also founder of that company as well. And something that's really important for both those companies is personality and personality theory. And so that's what our conversation is about today. We talk about what it is and how to measure it. And so we talk about specifically the type he uses and the type that he believes is the most effective and strongest use for that, and that's the one he uses for his company. And we also talk about like what some of the limitations are. But this is an important conversation to have, to talk about personality types. I personally find it fascinating, but it is really important because it helps us reflect on ourselves and know about ourselves, right? So for that introspection element, it's a pretty important topic, right? We're all people and we're all persons, and persons include personality. Personality is a big part of persons. And so for ourselves, it's really important, but it's also important for companies and for ourselves to interact with other people. So to mediate issues, to prevent tensions from building up, and also find ways to build off of each other and become stronger and better. So we have this conversation. We talk about some things that companies can do. We talk about some things we can do to better understand ourselves. We have some fun with it. I had a blast with it. We found out a lot of interesting things. We had some good insights, and we even found out what personality style Darth Vader has. So check it out and listen and see for yourself. Hello everybody, I'm here with Eric Kershat, owner of Harmony Insights and founder of HR Hot Seat. We're here to talk about communication in diverse personality styles. I think this conversation will probably go a lot more into the personality styles than about into the communication, but we'll see how we communicate on that topic. So the first question I have is, you with your company, Harmony Insights, and even I think it just seemed like this was infiltrating into your HR hot seats a little bit too, you use personality assessments and personality theory, and that seems to be a really big part of like everything you do. So my first question then is, what personality theory do you prescribe to personally?
So for me, anybody who knows me, if you stop by my LinkedIn page, you'll see the words disc nerd there very prominently. I come by it honestly. I am a big fan and practitioner of the disc model of human behavior, which was first proposed by a guy named William Moulton Marsden in 1928, who also happens to be, I think, the creator of Wonder Woman, if I got that right, and the lie detector test, which is really interesting, among some other things. But he first came up with the theory in 1928, but it wasn't really made popular until around the 1970s with measurements or instruments that actually measured his model of human behavior and personality.
Okay, so wait. So if you're the guy who made the lasso of truth also made the lie test. That's funny. So you personally like this theory a lot. And what do you mean by like the instruments though? You said there only more recently were instruments made that could use that. What instruments are you talking about?
So initially it was theory. It was, he was talking in terms of theory that had been around for quite some time, but he pulled it together in sort of a unique way that was then adopted by others along the way. Carl Jung and other folks sort of based what they had to say in very similar theories. But the more widely used instruments, assessments, conversation, common language around what DISC was and what it could be wasn't really popularized until the 70s. So prior to then, it was primarily theory. I'm sure there was assessment, but just not certainly at the level that we saw several decades later.
Okay, so it was the assessment tools that were the ones that got sort of pioneered later on?
Exactly right. As the theory continued to evolve and organizations moved forward with what it had been and what they saw the potential for it to be, those assessment tools and instruments became quite a bit more popular later in the 20th century.
Okay, so for everyone who didn't do what I did, and I had to I was like, disc. What's disc? So what is disc?
So DISC is a theory of human behavior or communication. You get a personality. You can look at it in a number of different ways that says that primarily we are a mix of four basic behavior or communication styles, personality styles, D, I, S, and C. And so it's one of those common languages that attempts to, I'm very careful about how I say this, not necessarily to pigeonhole people, not to label people, but to help us have a common language about our natural tendencies and preferences when it comes to how we behave and how we interact with others and how we communicate. I'm the first to say that we're so much more than our DISC style or any personality style, but I think it helps to have this common language to facilitate this discussion. So DISC is saying we're primarily a mix of a style called dominance and the traits and preferences that come along with that, influence, steadiness, and conscientiousness. And as opposed to a number of other assessments that are out there, which I'm sure we'll get into, DISC is really focused on what I've already said, our preferences, our tendencies and preferences in the workplace. So rather than it being a predictive assessment that lets you know how well you're going to do or how well you're going to perform in any given job, it says, Felix, what do you prefer when you're communicating with other people? How do you prefer to be motivated? What are your potential fears when it comes to the work that you do? What is your preferred environment that will encourage you to do your best work? And allows then you and I as individuals to have a really insightful conversation about who we are and what we need from each other, but then allows teams and organizations to understand how people prefer to be set up, honestly, to do their best work.
Okay, so earlier, or not earlier, in the beginning when we were talking, you said that it's a way of looking at communication styles. And so is that like they're primarily how they like to be communicated to and how they primarily like to communicate forward?
Exactly right. So as a function of human behavior, as we are social with one another, personally and professionally, we have certain preferences in terms of how much detail is given to us or that we provide. Whether we talk in terms of people or tasks, if we're big into feelings and emotions or we use logic in the language, a lot of this is subconscious. Some of it we're certainly intentional about, but DISC is trying to give us, again, this common framework to say, what are those aspects of our personality and communication style? So going back to what you said earlier, communication is very much a part of this. What are those aspects of our natural behavior and communication style, much of which is not at the conscious level, that we want to become aware of so that we can manage it, so that we can use it to our advantage, so that we can play up those things that are strengths and use them to our advantage as strengths, but then also be aware of when those tendencies that come naturally to us and preferences that come naturally to us might be getting in our way in terms of wanting to connect meaningfully with other people and communicate productively with them.
That makes it very useful. Before I move into the next question, which actually comes right off that, I wanted to revisit something you said a minute ago that sort of like stuck with me. And it's like in my brain's like trying to process something. Yeah. And you said not to pigeonhole anybody and this to be a useful thing. And I think that's something funny is because I used to like talk a lot about personality styles and types with people. My biggest thing when it was originally introduced to me, these like the various personality styles, and people were like, "Oh, you're one of these," and I'm like, "No, I'm not one of those." And then they're like, "That's what one of your type would say," and I was like, "I hate all of you for this," because it was like you couldn't disprove it because they were like, "Yeah, that's just you acting your way." Like, of course you don't want to be put in a box. I'm like, "I'm not in a box. Don't put people in boxes." And so I think it's interesting and very valuable to understand these as like tools and not as all inclusive, because there are people who I've encountered people, and this originally. For a long time, I was like really discarding of like psychology as a whole, because there were too many people who'd be like, I study psychology, so I know how you think, and I can predict your every move. And I'm like, no, you can't. It's like, how close do you think I am to punching you, right? And you're probably wrong. So
sounds like I went into a very dangerous line of work.
I was like, this is ridiculous. But after a while, I became a lot more convinced of it. But especially because I became more aware of what you're saying and its use, and it being a very useful thing, because even if we aren't necessarily one of the disc letters, like I'm not a D, right? Or if I was a D, I might not be entirely based off of dominance, right? That not, I like, it's not me to a T. There's more to me than that. There's other parts, other facets. There are motivations. There are character traits. There is like the way I'll behave in places, the way like my sense of fashion or style, the way I like articulate myself, my vocabulary, all that stuff is stuff that's not necessarily personality type, but knowing a personality type is still really valuable in talking to somebody and in understanding yourself. In which I think these are points we'll get to more, but it's important to realize that, or at least from my perspective, that these things aren't, that's who you are. Once you take that test, that's you. Don't ever try diverging, because you won't. It's like it's a self-fulfilling prophecy or anything like that. These things aren't set in stone in that way, I think.
As I'm doing, yes, that's all very insightful. As I'm doing my coaching and facilitation, I'm very intentional about saying, this isn't me having figured you out. This isn't me saying, this is who you are. I've placed you in this bucket and you are doomed to act or behave in this way, or to experience these things in life, because that's very far from the truth. But for those people out there who value information and insight because it helps inform their decisions, it helps them pursue more meaningful relationships, it helps them communicate more productively in the workplace, it helps them find work that is uniquely rewarding and fulfilling, I want to come along with this common language and this platform and those aren't the words, that's not platform, but this is kind of like a structure for a conversation to help you do those things. To say, you could go through life blind to your strengths and your potential limitations and see how that works for you. You could go into personal relationships, trying to figure out who you are and not really having dug in and done the introspection that could be valuable in a personal relationship. Or you could have this framework, you could have this common language that says, given the information you have given to me, these are some things that you may want to watch out for. Some areas where you're going to thrive, some areas where you may get hung up for one reason or another. If you care to take those things into account, they could allow you to be and empower you to be a more effective communicator. They could empower you. If I go into a relationship, and want to work through that relationship with somebody, I would rather go into that relationship, a romantic relationship, for example, with my wife, armed with information about how I prefer that people show that they care about me, how I naturally care about other people, stuff that I may not have dug into introspectively to figure this out prior to getting into the relationship. But if someone can come to me with a common language to say, you can use this to your advantage to get along better with your wife, you better believe that I'm going to jump all over that if I want to have a successful relationship with my wife. And so it's rather than wanting to put you in any kind of bucket, it's me saying, let's try this on for size. Let's use this language and see if it's helpful to you as you go about doing whatever it is you want to accomplish.
Okay, so let's talking about it being useful. How can a workplace use it? So how can a workplace use your DISC assessments and such?
So the workplace is one of many environments where two or more people are coming together. And whenever that happens, there's going to be conflict. And so we have conflict wrapped up in this conversation as well. We have collaboration, we have conflict. Whenever two or more people together, you're going to have diverging opinions about something. How can we manage that? And as opposed to eliminating conflict, you hear some people talking about, well, let's eliminate it entirely, which I don't think is either possible or beneficial. How can we manage productive conflict? And so when you think about the workplace, conflict is often one of those words that comes pretty quickly to mind. And so organizations are using DISC in the onboarding process. A side note, it wasn't designed for the selection process because it's not a predictive tool. It doesn't predict how well you're going to perform in a given role. So teams are primarily using it when someone has already been brought on as part of the onboarding process to say, what are your preferences? How do you prefer to be communicated? How do you prefer to be led, supervised? In what environment do you do your best work? I can use that information to give you insight into yourself, but then also position you well in the team. And then as we bring people together, individuals together into teams, we can use DISC as that common language to say, how do we function? How do we operate as a team? How could we operate more effectively? How can we communicate more productively with one another or our respective audiences? So if this is a customer service team, how can we be more influential in terms of our audience? If this is an executive leadership team, how can we lead more effectively? If this is a team of newer managers who have only recently become responsible for the performance of others, how can we manage those people more effectively?
Okay. Oddly enough, I never really thought about conflict being part of that. I always assumed, I was like, oh yeah, you just play to your strengths, and it helps you be aware of your weaknesses, so you're sort of avoiding that. But I never really thought about the weaknesses being conflicts that will quite easily arise between people on opposite ends of like personality assessments. If they're like opposite, actually, I don't know, opposite might not be the right ones. The people who are like, I actually, in my experience, we found out that people who are opposite generally like really like each other because they're so stark. They're like, this person's real interesting. This is a very different person. Whereas someone who's like very close to them but different, it like bugs them because they feel like they're like similar, but there's like something grating. So maybe not the opposite ends, but people who are like those, wherever you want to say that they are, those people who are going to have that conflict create. And I never really thought about it as in that way, even though I guess that's probably the first thing as you said, most people would go to is like, well, let's try to keep the conflict down at work. And
well, let me give you a couple of examples. Would that be helpful?
Yeah, that might
specifically
be really helpful.
about conflict. So I think whenever there are differences in communication or behavioral style, however big or small, there's potential for conflict. So I'll give you two examples. The professional example is, you are somebody that comes along and you prefer this dominant style of behavior, which is very direct and decisive and embraces change. And let's move forward, let's move forward yesterday. It doesn't matter if people are following me. I'm still going to make progress, very competitive. You're working with somebody on your team who prefers that S or steadiness style, things being predictable and routine, less change if possible. Wants to take time to make sure that they have a system in place, get consensus among members of the team. So you have this side that wants to move quickly, this side that wants to move less quickly, this side that values progress, this side that values cooperation in systems. It's rife with conflict, or it could be. And that's not even a value statement. It's not a judgment. It's not good or bad. It's just saying that they are at odds with one another's values and priorities. And they may very well work well together on a team if each person realizes the other person is bringing something unique to that relationship. So let's take advantage of that. How can you help me? How can I help you? That is the best possible scenario. But it's very easy, you can imagine, in that case, for one person to be frustrated with the other person's preferred style. Let's think about a personal example. And so this is one that I share in my workshops. And anytime my wife and I have an argument, she says, this is going to end up in one of your workshops or on a podcast, isn't it? I'm like, yeah, probably, just so you know that's going to happen. She came, moved in with me into my condo. And I am very particular about where things go. I believe that everything has a place. And this was kind of my space that she was moving into. So I had already determined that there was a space for everything. She moves in, and she's a first grade teacher. And she's collecting these box tops that apparently at one point she was getting credit for. You could collect box tops from foods and then kind of mail them away for something. And these box tops were starting to collect on the island in my kitchen, just like a little pile, nothing else on the island. But now you have this little pile of box tops. And I let it go for a bit. Of course, I noticed it right away because in my mind, that's not where they go. And so eventually, even given the work that I do, these words came out of my mouth. I said, is that where they belong? Which is not what I should have said, right? And you can imagine the conversation that ensued. Long story short, my language, my preference was for things to be in very particular spaces. I was speaking a language of logic. She comes in speaking a language of emotion, saying, I've just moved in with you. I need to know that I can put things wherever I want to put them, and it's okay, that's all right. Her language was entirely feeling and emotion. I'm coming at it from one side, from a DISC perspective. She's coming at it from another side. We've committed the rest of our lives together, but yet there is this moment of tension and conflict where neither of us is sure that the other person understands the language that we speak.
Well, I mean, that definitely shows how valuable it would be to understand that. I think, to me, in my mind, one of the most valuable things about this could actually be empathy. Because if you're like, oh, that's not just you being like, one of you being like, oh, they're just so this way. It's more, oh, that's actually like, that's part of who you are. That's how you approach things. I can understand that. I guess I approach things in a different way. And it's not because it's like, oh, they're that person. They're like, but you really begin to understand that that's just a component of their personality. And so I think it becomes less grating when you're that occurs to you. It's not them being like, we need this done because I'm like hard person on this sort of point. I need to be in charge of things and make things done. You're like, ah, and then that conflict pops up. But you can be like, oh, that's them being that way. And I know I'm a very logical person, so let's talk this out. Let's be like, okay, look, these are the steps I'm taking. I think this will be valuable for us in the long run. And they're like, oh. And then if they understand that that's your approach, they'll suddenly start seeing why you're being valuable. And so then maybe something good will happen out of that.
You're getting to a point where you appreciate and embrace and then leverage differences rather than see them as bad in any way. Now, someone could just be malicious. Like there could be someone on your team that just doesn't belong on your team, right? So that's a behavioral issue that needs to be disciplined. And with my HR background, I'd be all over that too. But I think one of the biggest mistakes I see organizations make is that they let go of people. They push people out of the organization because they're not performing well, but they're not performing well because they haven't been put in a position and spoken to and led and supervised in a way that is consistent with their DISC preferences. And as soon as we're able to consider that people may need different things from us as supervisors than we are giving them in terms of communication and the environment in which we are having them do their work, we can intentionally position people to do well within our organizations rather than keeping them from doing well and then eventually pushing them out. And it's not fair to these folks who were never really given a chance to begin with.
I mean, it makes it the most use of the resources you have if you consider like the people in your organization, your assets. You're making your assets even more valuable. You're investing in them and making them better suited. So better investment in that way.
And you're managing costs associated with turnover. Like if you want to avoid costs associated with turnover, let's focus on the people that you already have on board and empower them to do their best work.
Yeah. That was a very, very effective articulation of that idea. So it's obvious that companies can use it. Can individuals use it too for like, if they're like looking for jobs, if they're, I don't know, they're trying to start a little company of their own, or they're doing side gigs, whatever. Can individuals be using it?
Of course. So that in addition to the coaching and facilitation that I do for organizations, I've done some career coaching as well. And we always start with a DISC assessment. You're getting the picture, right? Like this is something that is such a big part of who I am and what I do. My friends and family are like, okay, Eric, we get it. You like DISC. Can we talk about something else? But in the career coaching that I've done, we start with a DISC assessment, because what better framework to begin with than this assessment that will give you a clearer sense of in what environments you would do your best work, and how you function on teams and what you're looking for in terms of culture, potentially, if you want to link that in as well. And some folks that I've worked with have preferences that lend themselves well to very traditional work. And some folks that I've worked with are more well-suited, we'll say, for something a bit more entrepreneurial, where they are kind of calling the shots. And we just use that to inform our job search strategy as individuals.
Okay. So I've heard you speak on, I don't remember if it was a podcast or something. You were speaking on introversion, and I know that you brought this up many times, introversion and extroversion as communication styles and how those play into those. That's not actually something that shows up much on DISC. That's actually something that's more Carl Jung or the 16 or Myers-Briggs. So do you see value in other personality styles? Do you use them yourself at all? Or theories, other personality theories, and do you encourage them?
So, absolutely. That's a fantastic question. Like the last thing I want to do is paint DISC as a one size fits all, because it certainly is not. There are potential clients that come to me in companies and individuals that say, this is what I'm looking to do. And I'll say, well, maybe DISC isn't right for you. Myers-Briggs is another really popular one. It certainly does use that introversion, extroversion language more explicitly. The greatest correlation between DISC and Myers-Briggs is actually along those lines, where the C or conscientiousness style tends to be much more introverted, and the I or influencing style in DISC tends to be more extroverted. So there is, I think, a correlation between the two there. Myers-Briggs is a very popular assessment. I think there's a lot of research out there talking about how it is neither valid nor reliable as a scientific tool. So as long as you know that going into it, I honestly, I think anything that gives you that common language to ask these really deep questions, can be valuable as long as you know what you're getting into. Myers-Briggs is a popular one. Strengths Finder, which is now called Clifton Strengths, is another really good one that's put out by Gallup to start a conversation. There's the Hogan assessments. There are Predictive Index is another one that is a predictive tool, so helps predict people's performance in a position. I think they are all valuable. The question comes down to, what are your goals and objectives? What are you looking to achieve? And if what you're looking to achieve is related not only to getting insight into your own strengths, but understanding then the strengths of other people and how you can connect and communicate and work with them more productively, that's where I think DISC really does shine.
Okay. Will knowing the personality tests, do you think, help individuals, like either DISC or any type that they're going to use? Will knowing our own personality types, do you think, help us feel more fulfilled or productive, just as individuals? Maybe not in an organization, not in looking for jobs, but just in my life, in my work. Would my knowing my DISC style, I don't know, how do you say that? DISC, is it DISC style?
DISC style,
Okay, DISC style, or Myers-Briggs type, or my strength finder, strength set. Will knowing those things help me individually be more fulfilled and more productive?
I would say yes in two parts. One, knowing them, because then that gives you information that can inform your decisions and your actions. I don't think they'll be nearly as valuable if you don't also act on them. So knowing them, for those of us who value the insight, I could spend all day on the insight. Like, I love thinking about it. I love talking about it. I love knowing that I am a more insightful person about who I am and how I act because of these things. But I don't know that it allows me to do too much that I wouldn't have been able to do otherwise unless I act on that information as well. So, knowing my DISC preference, knowing my top 5 Clifton strengths, knowing the 4 letters when it comes to the Myers-Briggs, that's a great start. But then what am I doing with that information? How am I anticipating where I will do well, where I will be most comfortable, the relationships that I gravitate toward and away from, the style of work that I gravitate toward and away from, as well as how those natural tendencies and preferences could potentially be obstacles and potential limitations for me along the way.
Okay.
And once I start to make them decisions, actionable decisions based on that information, I think that's where you really start to see it being used in its most effective, valuable way.
I guess since everyone's very individual, or the type of personality test they're using, that action step set will be different for everybody then. Like, there's no, these are the actions you should take once you know. Then I guess you can't really prescribe it without having the more fine-tuned knowledge of what type of personality it is.
Yeah, not a blanket statement, but it really comes down to what you're looking to achieve. So if you come to me and say, hey, I would love to use my results to help me communicate more effectively with my boss, we're going to look at, okay, what does this assessment say about your natural tendencies and preferences? What do we know about your boss? How can we people read to get a sense of what your boss's style might be, what their values and priorities are? And honestly, we don't even have to speak specifically in DISC terms, but we can talk in terms of what words do they use? What does it seem that they value and prioritize? Why do we believe those things? What information do we have at our disposal? And then how can we use that information? If someone instead comes to me and says, you know what, I don't feel like the work that I'm doing is very fulfilling to me, or the way that I'm doing it, and then we talk through, okay, well, how are you doing it? Well, now that everyone's working from home, I have no structure. I'm sitting at home, I'm trying to figure out how to prioritize things. We look at your DISC preferences and we realize that you're someone who thrives under what someone else might call micromanagement. You actually want somebody kind of hovering over your shoulder to say, okay, here are your deadlines. Here's what I want your next steps to be. If you thrive in that environment and now you find yourself working from home without that sort of oversight and guidance, no wonder you'd be floundering. No wonder you'd be questioning whether or not you're doing the right work. You're probably doing the right work, but just not in the right environment. We can use your DISC, or other assessment results to put you in a better place.
Okay, so I guess this more goes to the theory and less to the usefulness of it in some ways. But so this is, I guess, a question: is personality something that we're like it's already ingrained in innately in us, or does our backgrounds affect that personality? a lot? Like where we live, where we're from, do those things play into our personality?
I think, I mean, I'm sure given your own experience with this stuff, you're familiar with the nature versus nurture argument that, what are you born with and what does society nurture? And I think personality, it can be argued from both perspectives that there are components of each. I think at least in what I've read and studied myself, have found that personality styles and traits are pretty deeply seated, that a lot of this is what you are born with, how you are wired. And actually, I was listening to a book. My wife and I took a road trip recently, and we listened to a book called Atomic Habits. And in that book, the author, and I forget his name, it's like James Clear, something like that. I'm sorry if I get that wrong. But he talks about that even immediately after birth in the hospital. So the babies are born, they're put into a room. If a loud sound is played, the babies who turn toward that loud sound later end up identifying as extroverts later in life. The babies who turn away from that loud sound later in life identify as introverts. So physiologically, introverts are more easily stimulated, so they look to avoid that stimulation in their environment and in their conversations. Extroverts are less easily stimulated, so they're often looking for that stimulation in their environment. So even, immediately after being born, babies are already demonstrating behaviors kind of associated with differences in personality style. So I think that that's a pretty strong argument that a lot of this stuff is very innate, that we are born with. But I think also then our upbringing, our education, our values that are given to us, perhaps by our parents, how society reinforces or discourages certain things along the way, help to mold and shape how those innate personality traits and preferences end up being demonstrated.
I didn't mean, I knew I was going with a nurture question, and I was like trying not to like force your hand because I know that reveals too much. Like, some people are very strongly sided on that issue. And so anyone who like picks one or the other, they're like, oh, how dare you? And they get, very upset about that. So I wasn't trying to get trick you into it.
No, that's all right.
Yeah, it was more to get into the next point. So if it is more innate, then there were so many things you were saying that I was like, oh, like the atomic habits, and also, sorry, this is me tangenting before I get back into the point I was gonna make, or the question I was gonna ask. But also, I think the idea that stimulus and how sensitive you are to stimulus, I think, could be a really valuable way to look at introversion versus extroversion, because I think so many people want to say, oh, it's how much you like being around other people. And everyone likes being around other people, at least a little bit. But and everyone also likes to be by themselves a little bit. And sometimes. So those measures have always been ones that really sort of frustrated me. But I think if you talk about the sensitivity to stimuli, I think that would be a much more interesting way to examine it. And I think that might be a much more truthful way to examine that. Sorry, that's a personal revelation for me, partially because I am like on personality assessments and stuff. Like I take them and whatnot, but like I've never feel like I trust the results, just because like I feel like I'm a loose cannon for personality, and I also feel like I change drastically where I go. So I think I accommodate to the situation, and I turn myself into its opposite to balance out the place. So if I have two friend groups, my wife's and my own original friend group, and my original friend group they're all like really quiet, nerdy people, and they're a small group. And so I'm much more like boisterous around them, so they think that I'm very extroverted. But then when I'm around my wife's friends, I'm quiet, I'm analytical and stuff, and I balance them out. So then it's like on the personality test, it's like, what are you? I'm like, I don't know. But I think the idea that sensitivity to stimuli would be an interesting one.
Let me say, just on that point, because it's a very important point that you bring up, that you're talking now about two different environments. And so that's one of the defining factors of DISC as well, where some other assessments out there attempt to paint this picture of your underlying personality traits that are consistent across environments, which could very much be true. DISC is saying, given that there may still be those consistent personality traits, you have the ability, you have the agency to choose your behavior in any given environment. And so where you might take another assessment a couple of times in a single year, over a couple of years, and find that you have very similar results, you would expect that. With DISC, you can take it twice in the same week and get different results because it's focused on how do you perceive yourself and how do you perceive your environment. And whenever one of those two things changes, you get promoted, you experience a death in the family, you're just not as confident today as you were yesterday, you're kind of down about things, you're having an argument with your boss. Whenever one of those things changes, your roadmap changes, your blueprint changes. And so in your situation, what I was thinking of is it's quite possible that with your friends, not only in relation to them are you maybe a little bit more boisterous, but you could be choosing a behavior because you're with people that you're really familiar with, that know you inside and out, that have seen you at your at your worst. And you're factoring that into, whether or not it's conscious, how you communicate with them and how you relate with them. With your wife's friend group, which could be newer in general, they don't quite know you as well as they know her. You could still be trying to make a good impression. Any number of you may be curious about how they operate, so you may be a little bit more analytical about it. Whether or not you're conscious of it, you are choosing a different communication or behavioral style with that group because now you view your environment to have changed. And that's, I don't want to belabor this point, but it's one of the things I love about DISC is it says, we are who we are. We're wired how we're wired. We still have the ability to embrace what comes naturally to us and use that to our advantage, or adapt in ways that allow us to be even more effective given the environment in which we find ourselves.
Somehow you managed to take my tangent and insert and bring it back to the point I was originally going to go to. And that does environment and location change it? And do you change the personality, or at least the expression of that personality where you go? Because that's been a question. In many senses, I'm very introspective, and I'm so confused about myself because at work, everyone's he's so quiet. I've had that multiple times. I remember there was one time one of my first bosses when I was young wrote me a letter recommendation, and it said, "A man of few words," and everyone in my family sort of looked at me. They're like, "How is that possible? You're known as one of the most talkative people. All their stories are about how I don't shut up." And I was like, it's true though. I don't talk. And then other places I'm a chatterbox. So I'm
Yeah.
I don't know what I am. I'm so confused. And so I think it is really important to be aware that environments and background, where you're at, has such a tremendous effect on your expression of your personality. So I think it is really fascinating and really good that something like DISC takes into account the fact that your work you might not be your at home you. And so you need to be aware of those two being different. And so if you want to optimize one place over another, be aware of which one that is. So maybe my question was originally, is there value in retaking the test? And you sort of answered that question. It is important to take it, I guess, multiple times, or at least that's what I'm taking from what you said when you said you could take it one week and then a different week, and based off if situations change or what have you. So
I would say, especially with DISC, I would recommend retaking it whenever how you perceive yourself or your environment has changed. I know that's kind of a sort of an academic way of putting it, but it's whenever you have a new goal or objective, and the players and the environment looks different, then it's worth retaking the assessment. You're going to respond to those questions differently depending on what you have in mind. And I want to give you the blueprint and the roadmap for whatever unique relationship or environment or situation you have in mind. But that is also something that's unique to DISC. Some of the other assessments, you don't have to retake them as often. And so people are less concerned about that. But because DISC is so specific to how you view yourself and your environment in any given time, I want to make sure that we're basing our decisions on the best information.
Mm-hmm. So one last question, I guess, because we've been moving for a while. One last fun question. Do you think you can figure out the personality types of do what you called, I think you called earlier, type reading of other people, but specifically of celebrities? Because I know everyone sort of loves figuring out what celebrities are. They're ooh, I have the same type as this celebrity. So you think that's possible?
Yeah, and it's funny you mentioned that. So the page on my website, harmonyinsights.com, Harmony Insights is my company. The page on my website by far that gets the most traffic is the one where I have the DISC styles of various celebrities. By far the most traffic. I don't know why that is, but I'm happy it works out that way. So for example, the conscientiousness style that values accuracy and things being just right in detail and all of that, like that Lisa Simpson from The Simpsons is an example of that. personality style. Darth Vader from Star Wars is more of that D or dominant style, direct and decisive. And I mean, just about any TV show, any movie, any cartoon, you can do what you do with people. You can people read and say, okay, what does it appear that this person values? What do they prioritize based on their behavior, the words they're using, how they use those words, both verbal and nonverbal communication, all the stuff that I teach in my workshops about how people can connect more effectively with one another. You can read into fictional characters and assign disc styles as well. Along those lines, it's one thing to assign disc styles and say, Felix, I think you are this based on your behavior. There's nothing that compares with having you tell me what you value and prioritize. Mm-hmm. So step one is, in the absence of having you take an assessment, what is my assessment of you based on what I know of DISC? And then that will help me, potentially communicate more effectively with you. Step two is, you tell me, Felix, like, forget about me assigning anything to you or labeling you in any way, which of course I don't want to do. You tell me, what do you value? What do you prioritize? What do you need from me as your supervisor? What do you need from your environment? That is the information that becomes really golden.
I could keep having this conversation for hours.
I can tell.
I think I need to like put a stop on it and move to our sort of like our fun questions. Cause if I don't stop, I'm going to keep going forever. Like, even
we'll have to clear our afternoon.
I was like, yes. Oh, right. The whole time it's going, I'm just like, so many things, so many, like, it makes connections. I have additional questions. This is a topic that is.
You want to bring your wife into the discussion? Invite her into the booth with you?
I have, oh goodness gracious. So I'm going to do these quick 10 fun questions.
Let's do it.
And we'll see where we go. So first question is, what book do you think everybody should read?
Let's see, actually. You know what? I know you gave me a sense of what you might be asking. I made some notes, but I think the one I would go with is Quiet by Susan Cain. Quiet is sort of the definitive book about introversion, actually. So for people who are introverts or people who know and love introverts or work with introverts, Quiet by Susan Cain and her TED Talk on the same topic is just a really, really insightful read.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I've never heard of that book, but I might have to add it to my list. Atomic Habits I've heard about, like, it was on my list, but I'd never heard of Quiet by Susan Cain. Okay. What was the last thing you splurged on?
It's funny you say that. I'm looking at it right here. I'm not much of a splurger myself, but because of how much time I spend in front of my computer, I bought tools and materials to customize my desk setup. So I have LED panel lights. I have a DSLR camera that I use as a webcam off to the side, and I've sort of pimped out. I'm thinking back to MTV's Pimp My Ride. I've pimped my desktop setup to make it a little bit more enjoyable to spend time in front of. Microphone on a boom arm.
Yep. All right. What is your most useless talent or superpower?
I guess it depends on the situation, but I can have long been able to say the alphabet backwards. That is something that I've long done, and I have a pretty spot-on impersonation or impression of Kermit the Frog.
Hey.
Neither of which I do on by request, but those are things I feel like I do really well that nobody really cares about.
Yeah. I never can tell what my most useless are, but I do like a lot of voice impersonations too, and Kermit the Frog's on there, but it's like, it's not particularly useful.
Not really. It's never gotten me a job.
What is the most interesting thing you have seen or read this week?
There was a New York Times article that talks about how we are all socially awkward now, how much time we are spending away from society and away from friends and family and kind of by ourselves. And it made some fantastic points about what we really need from one another, what we need from society, and what we turn into, what we could potentially struggle with in the absence of those things. So I thought it was really compelling. I shared it on social media.
That is actually interesting. What would a world populated only by clones of you be like?
That's dangerous, especially these days. For people who can see our conversation, it would have far too much facial hair. This is a new thing for me, and so I'm still not sure it's a good idea. So there would be far too much facial hair. I think that there would be a lot of talk of craft beer and Avengers movies. My wife and I just got through the entire chronologically ordered Avengers series, and we've been talking a lot about that. In terms of disc, the world would be far too detail oriented, far too analytical, and far too slow to make decisions.
Okay. I guess in your analytical opinion, or maybe
Yeah.
not, just experientially, what as a child did you think would be awesome, but as an adult it turns out is not?
You know what? I remember thinking it will be so fantastic the day that I can stay up as late as I want and nobody has anything to say about it. And these days, it's like the later I stay up, and I've been doing that a lot lately for work reasons, I'm far more exhausted. And I think that probably is more of a component of how much sleep I'm getting than how late I'm staying up. But at one point, I thought staying up as late as you want was going to be the coolest thing. I mean, growing up in general, just getting older and being older than some other people is going to be the coolest thing ever. You know, you can pull rank. And then you do stay up late and you're older than some other people and you think, not as exciting as I thought it was going to be.
Okay. What word is a lot of fun to say?
Some of my favorite words include malarkey. I say malarkey a lot. I think it's a fantastic word. Chutzpah, you know, I've had Jewish friends along the way that are very familiar with Yiddish, and I think that it means sort of like, you know, audacity, you know, that you have a lot of chutzpah. Chicken has always been a funny word to me. I don't know why. I love the word chicken. I think there's like CH and K sounds are tend to be funny, but yeah, those are some of my favorites.
Nice.
I'm concerned about what these are all saying about my own personality style.
No, well, I love how you brought up like chicken, because most people, when they say things like this, they're like really obscure words or words in other languages. But you pointed out like a very commonly used word that you find bizarre. And I think that's so fantastic because very few people are willing to reflect on common things because they're just so commonplace. So they become less notable, like, and
Yeah.
so then they make less note of them. I think it's so fascinating, just real things, random things. Like I'm the weird person that's like, have you ever seen how weird your fingers are? Like, like I'm that person.
Yeah.
And so I'm hearing the word chicken. I'm like, yeah, chicken's weird. Like,
It's
but
a
I'll
funny
like
word.
it's
Yeah.
yeah, it's such a weird
I
word.
think
And
bratwurst is a funny word. I think bratwurst and I think pants for some reason. Like these are just words that if I'm trying to be funny, I will work in somehow. And I think that they're just everyday, normal, everyday words. But there's something about chicken that just makes me laugh. So
I love the French word for pants, pantalon. It's so
yeah.
fun. I love it.
Yeah,
It's like
pantaloons. I've said pantaloons before. That's hilarious. That's just a funny word, especially when you're using it in regular, serious conversation in place of the word that people are expecting. Like they're expecting pants. You know, why wouldn't I just say pants? Throw in pantaloons. It's hilarious. Like it's just a funny. That's partially the word itself, and then partially the application or the expression of that word.
yeah. What is something everybody in the world can agree on? And it's obviously not that chicken is a weird word, or maybe it will be now.
Yeah, it could be. Who knows? You let me know about some of these in advance, and I would hope that everybody in the world could agree that Crystal Pepsi was just an awful idea. I don't know if this is something that you're familiar with, but along the way there was such a thing as Crystal Pepsi that was clear, and it was just awful, and should never have come about. That is a joke, of course. I would imagine that most of the world would agree that for most people, not everybody, but 2020 has just been an awful year. You know, pandemics, politics. I mean, everything kind of thrown in. I think that there are some people probably who've had it really well and have done well and have been happy and prosperous. But I think for a lot of people, 2020 has just been pretty rough.
Okay, so if you could disinvent one thing, what would it be?
that's that's a fantastic question. My immediate response is charades, the party game charades.
What? I love that game, but
Nope.
I'll let you
No.
go.
I mean, as an introvert, I am uncomfortable being put on the spot, you know, in the spotlight, and especially to act out like that. I've just always loathed the game charades. I intentionally took an improv class, a beginner's improv class, to put myself in a position where I knew I was going to be outside of my comfort zone. And it's one of the greatest things I've ever done. I stopped after one class. I didn't keep going. But there's something about the game charades that whenever someone suggests it, I just want to run in the opposite direction.
I love charades because I'm a little theatrical, just sometimes, in the right place, and I love doing voices and such, and just very exaggerate. I have an unusually exaggerated face, I think, and so any expression I have is like,
Yeah, it's big.
it's humongous. So
But
I
you
love
can't
the game
even do your
charades.
voices in charades, though.
I know. Well, there's different versions of like charades, and some of which you can make like sounds, and I'm like,
Oh.
yes, because I can make a lot of sounds.
I don't know. It's a very visceral thing. I'm sure other people have said things that are probably much more meaningful, but to me, I would disinvent
Oh no,
charades.
I mean it's fine. Yeah, I don't think the world would be a worse place if we didn't have charades. Okay, last question. What life skills are rarely taught but are very useful?
I'm going to call these skills, but the skills of introspection, being introspective, I think is a skill that can be learned. I think connecting with other people, connection in general. I think influencing. I think these are life skills. There are soft skills, leadership skills, people skills, whatever you want to call them. I think we're taught a lot of hard skills along the way, but I don't know that we're formally taught some of these soft skills that end up being far more valuable to you than almost anything else you're going to learn in a formal setting. If you're somebody who's likable, you connect easily with others, you're influential, you will get, I guarantee you will get farther in life for so many reasons than if you're not those things. It doesn't mean you can't be educated on other things or in more traditional ways. I value education as a whole in whatever form it takes. But I think some of these soft skills are just so valuable and so not taught to us earlier on in life, if ever.
I think it's interesting that went so closely with what we were talking about, and also like the introspection, but also soft skills, because soft skills are so closely tied to personalities in many ways, because they're often how we show our soft skills, and it also takes a lot of soft skills to navigate our way around other people with other differing personalities, and so it's just everything revolving around personality, revolving around interaction, has so much emphasis on soft skills. I think that was a really good place in like introspection, really good place to end this. So say thank you. Goodbye to everyone listening. Check out Eric Kershat on LinkedIn, or you can check him out on Twitter and Facebook at Harmony Insights, his company, or you can go to his website and visit the celebrity page, find out what time Jessica and everyone is. Just drive those numbers up, so it's absurd.
Exactly right. I would welcome you wherever you want to find me, but this has been a great conversation, Felix. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. It was definitely my pleasure. So until next time, thank you for listening to the Humans Over Numbers podcast, brought to you by Milestones. If you found it informative or entertaining, please like, subscribe, or leave a comment or review. I'm your host, Felix, and until next time.